Rain streamed off the black walls of the temple. The only sign of life was the horse tethered outside, and it wasn't Two Flowers' horse. For one thing, it was too big. It was a white charger with hooves the size of meat dishes and leather harness aglitter with ostentatious gold ornamentation. It was currently enjoying a nosebag. There was something familiar about it. Rincewind tried to remember where he had seen it before. It looked as though it was capable of a fair turn of speed anyway, a speed which, once it had lumbered up to it, it could maintain for a long time. All Rincewind had to do was shake off his guards, fight his way out of the tree, find the temple, and steal the horse out from under whatever it was that Bel-Shamharath used for a nose. "The Cinder of Eight has two for dinner, it seems," said Druelle, looking hard at Rincewind. "Who does that steed belong to, false wizard?"
"I've no idea."
"No? Well, it does not matter. We shall see soon enough." She waved a hand. The focus of the image moved inward, darted through a great octagonal archway, and sped along the corridor within. There was a figure there, sidling along stealthily with its back against one wall. Rincewind saw the gleam of gold and bronze. There was no mistaking that shape. He'd seen it many times. The wide chest, the neck like a tree trunk, the surprisingly small head under its wild thatch of black hair looking like a tomato on a coffin. He could put a name to the creeping figure, and that name was Harun the Barbarian. Harun was one of the Circle C's more durable heroes, a fighter of dragons, a despoiler of temples, a hired sword, the king post of every street brawl. He could even, and unlike many heroes of Rincewind's acquaintance, speak words of more than 2 syllables, if given time and maybe a hint or two. There was a sound on the edge of Rincewind's hearing. It sounded like several skulls bouncing down the steps of some distant dungeon. He looked sideways at his guards to see if they had heard it. They had all their limited attention focused on Harun, who was admittedly built on the same lines as themselves. Their hands were resting lightly on the wizard's shoulders. Rincewind ducked, jerked backwards like a tumbler, and came up running. Behind him, he heard Druelle shout, and he redoubled his speed. Something caught the hood of his robe, which tore off. A he-dryad, waiting at the stairs, spread his arms wide and grinned woodenly at the figure hurtling toward him. Without breaking his stride, Rincewind ducked again, so low that his chin was on a level with his knees, while a fist like a log sizzled through the air by his ear. Ahead of him, a whole spinney of the treemen awaited. He spun around, dodged another blow from the puzzled guard, and sped back toward the circle, passing on the way the dryads who were pursuing him and leaving them as disorganized as a set of skittles. But there were still more in front, pushing their way through the crowds of females and smacking their fists into the horny palms of their hands with anticipatory concentration. "Stand, false wizard," said Druelle, stepping forward. Behind her, the enchanted dancers spun on. The focus of the circle was now drifting along a violet-lit corridor. Rincewind cracked. "Will you knock that off?" he snarled. "Let's just get this straight, right? I am a real wizard." He stamped a foot petulantly. "Indeed?" said the dryad. "Then let us see you pass a spell." Began Rincewind. The fact was that since the ancient and mysterious spell had squatted in his mind, he had been unable to remember even the simplest cantrip for, say, killing cockroaches or scratching the small of his back without using his hands. The mages at Unseen University had tried to explain this by suggesting that the involuntary memorizing of the spell had, as it were, tied up all his spell retention cells. In his darker moments, Rincewind had come up with his own explanation as to why even minor spells refused to stay in his head for more than a few seconds. They were scared, he decided. He repeated. A small one would do, said Druile, watching him curl his lips in a frenzy of anger and embarrassment. She signaled, and a couple of he-dryads closed in. The spell chose that moment to vault into the temporarily abandoned saddle of Rincewind's consciousness. He felt it sitting there, leering defiantly at him. I do know a spell, he said wearily. Yes, pray tell, said Druile. Rincewind wasn't sure that he dared, although the spell was trying to take control of his tongue. He fought it.
You said you could. You said he could read bind,
he said indistinctly.
Read it.
She stepped forward, looking mockingly into his eyes. Her smile froze. Her hands raised protectively. She crouched back. From her throat came a sound of pure terror. Rincewind looked around. The rest of the dryads were also backing away. What had he done? Something terrible, apparently. But in his experience, it was only a matter of time before the normal balance of the universe restored itself and started doing the usual terrible things to him. He backed away, ducked between the still spinning dryads who were creating the magic circle, and watched to see what Druile would do next. Grab him, she screamed. Take him a long way from the tree and kill him. Rincewind turned and bolted across the focus of the circle. There was a brilliant flash. There was a sudden darkness. There was a vaguely Rincewind-shaped violet shadow dwindling to a point and winking out. There was nothing at all. Harun the Barbarian crept soundlessly along the corridors, which were lit with a light so violet that it was almost black. His earlier confusion was gone. This was obviously a magical temple, and that explained everything. It explained why, earlier in the afternoon, he had espied a chest by the side of the track while riding through this benighted forest. Its top was invitingly open, displaying much gold. But when he had leapt off his horse to approach it, the chest had sprouted legs and had gone trotting off into the forest, stopping again a few hundred yards away. Now, after several hours of teasing pursuit, he had lost it in these hell-lit tunnels. On the whole, the unpleasant carvings and occasional disjointed skeletons he passed held no fears for Harun. This was partly because he was not exceptionally bright while being at the same time exceptionally unimaginative. But it was also because odd carvings and perilous tunnels were all in a day's work. He spent a great deal of time in similar situations, seeking gold or demons or distressed virgins and relieving them respectively of their owners, their lives, and at least one cause of their distress. Observe Harun as he leaps cat-footed across a suspicious tunnel mouth. Even in this violet light, his skin gleams coppery. There is so much gold about his person in the form of anklets and wristlets, but otherwise he is naked except for a leopard skin loincloth. He took that in the steaming forests of Howendaland after killing its owner with his teeth. In his right hand, he carries the magical black sword of Cream, which was forged from a thunderbolt and has a soul but suffers no scabbard. Harun had stolen it only 3 days before from the impregnable palace of the Archimandrite of Etruni, and he was already regretting it. It was beginning to get on his nerves.
I tell you, it went down that last passage on the right,
hissed Kring in a voice like the scrape of a blade over stone. Be silent.
All I said was,
shut up. And Two Flower. He was lost. He knew that. Either the building was much bigger than it looked, or he was now on some wide underground level without having gone down any steps, or, as he was beginning to suspect, the inner dimensions of the place disobeyed a fairly basic rule of architecture by being bigger than the outside. And why all these strange lights? They were eight-sided crystals set at regular intervals in the walls and ceiling, and they shed a rather unpleasant glow that didn't so much illuminate as outline the darkness. And whoever had done those carvings on the wall, Two Flower thought charitably, had probably been drinking too much for years. On the other hand, it was certainly a fascinating building. Its builders had been obsessed with the number 8. The floor was a continuous mosaic of 8-sided tiles. The corridor walls were angled to give the corridors 8 sides if the walls and ceilings were counted, and in those places where part of the masonry had fallen in, Two Flower noticed that even the stones themselves had 8 sides.
I don't like it,
said the picture imp from his box around Two Flower's neck.
Why not?
Inquired Two Flower.
It's weird. But you're a demon. Demons can't call things weird. I mean, what's weird to a demon?
Oh, you know, said the demon cautiously, glancing around nervously and shifting from claw to claw. Things, stuff. Two Flower looked at him sternly.
What things?
The demon coughed nervously. Demons do not breathe. However, every intelligent being, whether it breathes or not, coughs nervously at some time in its life. And this was one of them, as far as the demon was concerned.
Oh, things, it said wretchedly. Evil things. Things we don't talk about is the point I'm broadly trying to get across, master.
Two Flower shook his head wearily.
I wish Rincewind was here, he said. He'd know what to do.
Him? Sneered the demon.
Can't see a wizard coming here. They can't have anything to do with the number 8.
The demon slapped a hand across his mouth guiltily. Two Flower looked up at the ceiling.
What was that?
He asked.
Didn't you hear something? Me? Hear? No, not a thing, the demon insisted.
It jerked back into its box and slammed the door. Two Flower tapped on it. The door opened a crack.
It sounded like a stone moving,
he explained. The door banged shut. Two Flower shrugged.
The place is probably falling to bits,
he said to himself. He stood up.
I say,
he shouted.
Is anyone there?
Air, 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 replied the dark tunnels.
Hello?
He tried. Low, low, low.
I know there's someone here. I just heard you playing dice.
Ice, ice, ice.
Look, I had just...
Two Flower stopped. The reason for this was the bright point of light that had popped into existence a few feet from his eyes. It grew rapidly, and after a few seconds was the tiny, bright shape of a man. At this stage, it began to make a noise, or rather, Two Flower started to hear the noise it had been making all along. It sounded like a sliver of a scream caught in one long instant of time. The iridescent man was doll-sized now, a tortured shape tumbling in slow motion while hanging in mid-air. Two Flower wondered why he hadn't thought of the phrase, "a sliver of a scream," and began to wish he hadn't. It was beginning to look like Rincewind. The wizard's mouth was open, and his face was brilliantly lit by the light of what? Strange suns? Two Flower found himself thinking. Suns men don't usually see. He shivered. Now the turning wizard was half man-size. At that point, the growth was faster. There was a sudden crowded moment, a rush of air, and an explosion of sound. Rincewind tumbled out of the air, screaming. He hit the floor hard, choked, then rolled over with his head cradled in his arms and his body curled up tightly. When the dust had settled, Two Flower reached out gingerly and tapped the wizard on the shoulder. The human ball rolled up tighter. "It's me," explained Two Flower helpfully. The wizard unrolled a fraction. "What?" he said. "Me." In one movement, Rincewind unrolled and bounced up in front of the little man, his hands gripping his shoulders desperately. His eyes were wild and wide. "Don't say it," he hissed. "Don't say it, and we might get out." "Get out? How did you get in? Don't you know?" "Don't say it." Two Flower backed away from this madman. "Don't say it." "Don't say what?" "The number." "Number?" said Two Flower. "Hey, Rincewind." "Yes, number. Between 7 and 9. 4 plus 4. "What, 8? Rincewind's hands clapped over the man's mouth. "Say it and we're doomed. Just don't think about it, right? Trust me." "I don't understand," wailed Two Flower. Rincewind relaxed slightly, which was to say that he still made a violin string look like a bowl of jelly. "Come on," he said. "Let's try and get out, and I'll try and tell you." After the first age of magic, the disposal of grimoires began to become a severe problem on the Discworld. A spell is still a spell, even when imprisoned temporarily in parchment and ink. It has potency. This is not a problem while the book's owner still lives, but on his death, the spellbook becomes a source of uncontrolled power that cannot easily be diffused. In short, spellbooks leak magic. Various solutions have been tried. Countries near the rim simply loaded down the books of dead mages with leaden pantalphas and threw them over the edge. Near the hub, less satisfactory alternatives were available. Inserting the offending books in canisters of negatively polarized octaron and sinking them in the fathomless depths of the sea was one. Burial in deep caves on land was earlier ruled out after some districts complained of walking trees and five-headed cats. But before long, the magic seeped out, and eventually fishermen complained of shoals of invisible fish or psychic clams. A temporary solution was the construction, in various centers of magical lore, of large rooms made of denatured octaron, which is impervious to most forms of magic. Here, the more critical grimoires could be stored until their potency had attenuated. That was how there came to be at Unseen University the Octavo, greatest of all grimoires, formerly owned by the creator of the universe. It was this book that Rincewind had once opened for a bet. He had only a second to stare at a page before setting off various alarm spells, but that was time enough for one spell to leap from it and settle in his memory like a toad in a stone.
Then what?
Said Two-Flower.
Oh, they dragged me out, thrashed me, of course. And no one knows what the spell does?
Rincewind shook his head.
It had vanished from the page, he said. No one will know until I say it, or until I die, of course. Then it will sort of say itself. For all I know, it stops the universe, or ends time, or anything.
Two-Flower patted him on the shoulder.
No sense in brooding, he said cheerfully. Let's have another look for a way out.
Rincewind shook his head. All the terror had been spent now. He had broken through the terror barrier, perhaps, and was in the dead calm state of mind that lies on the other side. Anyway, he had ceased to gibber.
We're doomed, he stated. We've been walking around all night. I tell you, this place is a spider web. It doesn't matter which way we go. We'll end up in the center. It was kind of you to come looking for me, anyway, said Two-Flower. How did you manage it exactly? It was very impressive. Oh, well, began the wizard awkwardly. I just thought, I can't leave old Two-Flower there, and so what we've got to do now is find this Bel-Shamharoth person and explain things to him, and perhaps he'll let us out, said Two-Flower.
Rincewind ran a finger around his ear.
It must be the funny echoes in here, he said. I thought I heard you use the words like find and explain. That's right.
Rincewind glared at him in the hellish purple glow.
Find Bel-Shamharoth, he said. Yes, we don't have to get involved. Find the Sorinder and not get involved. Just give him a nod, I suppose, and ask the way to the exit. Explain things to the cinder of Ening.
Rincewind bent off the end of the word just in time and finished.
You're insane. Hey, come back.
He darted down the passage after Two-Flower, and after a few moments came to a halt with a groan. The violet light was intense here, giving everything new and unpleasant colors. This wasn't a passage. It was a wide room with walls to a number that Rincewind didn't dare to contemplate, and 7A passages radiating from it. Rincewind saw, a little way off, a low altar with the same number of sides as 4 times 2. It didn't occupy the center of the room, however. The center was occupied by a huge stone slab with twice as many sides as a square. It looked massive. In the strange light, it appeared to be slightly tilted, with one edge standing proud of the slabs around it. Two-Flower was standing on it.
Hey, Rincewind, look what's here.
The luggage came ambling down one of the other passages that radiated from the room.
That's great, said Rincewind. Fine, it can lead us out of here. Now,
Two-Flower was already rummaging in the chest.
Yes, he said, after I'd taken a few pictures. Just let me fit the attachment. I said now.
Rincewind stopped. Harun the barbarian was standing in the passage mouth directly opposite him, a great black sword held in one ham-sized fist. You? Said Harun uncertainly. Ha ha ha! Yes, said Rincewind. Harun, isn't it? Long time no see. What brings you here? Harun pointed to the luggage. That, he said. This much conversation seemed to exhaust Harun. Then he added, in a tone that combined statement, claim, threat, and ultimatum. Mine. It belongs to Two Flower here, said Rincewind. Here's a tip. Don't touch it. It dawned on him that this was precisely the wrong thing to say. But Harun had already pushed Two Flower away and was reaching for the luggage, which sprouted legs, backed away, and raised its lids threateningly. In the uncertain light, Rincewind thought he could see rows of enormous teeth, white as bleached beechwood. Harun, he said quickly, there's something I ought to tell you. Harun turned a puzzled face to him. What? He said. It's about numbers. Look, you know if you add 7 and 1, or 3 and 5, or take 2 from 10, you get a number. While you're here, don't say it, and we might all stand a chance of getting out of here alive, or merely just dead. Who is he? Asked Two Flower. He was holding a cage in his hands, dredged from the bottommost depths of the luggage. It appeared to be full of sulking pink lizards. I am Harun, said Harun proudly. Then he looked at Rincewind. What? He said. Just don't say it, okay? Said Rincewind. He looked at the sword in Harun's hand. It was black, the sort of black that is less a Keller than a graveyard of Kellers, and there was a highly ornate runic inscription up the blade. More noticeable still was the faint octarine glow that surrounded it. The sword must have noticed him too, because it suddenly spoke in a voice like a claw being scraped across glass. Strange, it said. Why can't he say 8? 8, 8, 8, said the echoes. There was the faintest of grinding noises deep under the earth. And the echoes, although they became softer, refused to die away. They bounced from wall to wall, crossing and recrossing, and the violet light flickered in time with the sound. You did it! Screamed Rincewind. I said you shouldn't say 8. He stopped, appalled at himself, but the word was out now and joined its colleagues in the general susurration. Rincewind turned to run, but the air suddenly seemed to be thicker than treacle. A charge of magic bigger than he had ever seen was building up. When he moved in painful slow motion, his limbs left trails of golden sparks that traced their shape in the air. Behind him there was a rumble as the great octagonal slab rose into the air, hung for a moment on one edge, and crashed down on the floor. Something thin and black snaked out of the pit and wrapped itself around his ankle. He screamed as he landed heavily on the vibrating flagstones. The tentacle started to pull him across the floor. Then Two Flower was in front of him, reaching out for his hands. He grasped the little man's arms desperately, and they lay looking into each other's faces. Rincewind slid on even so. What's holding you? He gasped. Nothing, said Two Flower. What's happening? I'm being dragged into this pit. What do you think? Oh, Rincewind, I'm sorry.
You're sorry.
There was a noise like a singing saw, and the pressure on Rincewind's legs abruptly ceased. He turned his head and saw Harun crouched by the pit, his sword a blur as it hacked at the tentacles racing out toward him. Two Flower helped the wizard to his feet, and they crouched by the altar stone, watching the manic figure as it battled the questing arms.
It won't work, said Rincewind. The cinder can materialize tentacles. What are you doing?
Two Flower was feverishly attaching the cage of subdued lizards to the picture box, which he had mounted on a tripod.
I've just got to get a picture of this, he muttered. It's stupendous. Can you hear me, Imp?
The picture imp opened his tiny hatch, glanced momentarily at the scene around the pit, and vanished into the box. Rincewind jumped as something touched his leg and brought his heel down on a questing tentacle.
Come on, he said. Time to go zoom.
He grabbed Two Flower's arm, but the tourist resisted.
Run away and leave her run with that thing, he said.
Rincewind looked blank.
Why not?
He said.
It's his job, but it'll kill him. It could be worse,
said Rincewind.
What? It could be us.
Rincewind pointed out logically.
Come on.
Two Flower pointed.
Hey, he said, it's got my luggage.
Before Rincewind could restrain him, Two Flower ran around the edge of the pit to the box, which was being dragged across the floor while its lid snapped ineffectually at the tentacle that held it. The little man began to kick at the tentacle in fury. Another one snapped out of the melee around Harun and caught him around the waist. Harun himself was already an indistinct shape amid the tightening coils. Even as Rincewind stared in horror, the hero's sword was wrenched from his grasp and hurled against a wall.
Your spell,
shouted Two Flower. Rincewind did not move. He was looking at the thing rising out of the pit. It was an enormous eye, and it was staring directly at him. He whimpered as a tentacle fastened itself around his waist. The words of the spell rose unbidden in his throat. He opened his mouth, as in a dream, shaping it around the first barbaric syllable. Another tentacle shot out like a whip and coiled around his throat, choking him. Staggering and gasping, Rincewind was dragged across the floor. One flailing arm caught Two Flower's picture box as it skittered past on its tripod. He snatched it up instinctively, as his ancestors might have snatched up a stone when faced with a marauding tiger. If only he could get enough room to swing it against the eye. The eye filled the whole universe in front of him. Rincewind felt his will draining away like water from a sieve. In front of him, the torpid lizards stirred in their cage on the picture box. Irrationally, as a man about to be beheaded notices every scratch and stain on the executioner's block, Rincewind saw that they had overlarge tails that were bluish-white, and, he realized, throbbing alarmingly. As he was drawn toward the eye, the terror-struck Rincewind raised the box protectively, and at the same time he heard the picture imp say,
They're about right now. Can't hold them any longer. Everyone smile, please.
There was a flash of light so white and so bright, it didn't seem like light at all. Bel Shamhamarath screamed, a sound that started in the far ultrasonic and finished somewhere in Rincewind's bowels. The tentacles went momentarily as stiff as rods, hurling their various cargoes around the room, before bunching up protectively in front of the abused eye. The whole mass dropped into the pit, and a moment later the big slab was snatched up by several dozen tentacles and slammed into place, leaving a number of thrashing limbs trapped around the edge. Harun landed rolling, bounced off a wall, and came up on his feet. He found his sword and started to chop methodically at the doomed arms. Rincewind lay on the floor, concentrating on not going mad. A hollow wooden noise made him turn his head. The luggage had landed on its curved lid. Now it was rocking angrily and kicking its little legs in the air. Warily, Rincewind looked around for Two Flower. The little man was in a crumpled heap against the wall, but at least he was groaning. The wizard pulled himself across the floor painfully and whispered, "What the hell was that?" "Why were they so bright?" muttered Two Flower. "Odds in my head." "Too bright," said Rincewind. He looked across the floor to the cage on the picture box. The lizards inside, now noticeably thinner, were watching him with interest. "The salamanders," moaned Two Flower. "The picture will be overexposed. I know it." "The salamanders?" asked Rincewind incredulously. "Of course, standard attachment." Rincewind staggered across to the box and picked it up. He'd seen salamanders before, of course, but they had been small specimens. They had also been floating in a jar of pickle in the Curio Biological Museum down in the cellars of Unseen University, since live salamanders were extinct around the Circle C. He tried to remember the little he knew about them. They were magical creatures. They also had no mouths, since they subsisted entirely on the nourishing quality of the octarine wavelength in the Discworld's sunlight, which they absorbed through their skins. Of course, they also absorbed the rest of the sunlight as well, storing it in a special sac until it was excreted in the normal way. A desert inhabited by Discworld salamanders was a veritable lighthouse at night. Rincewind put them down and nodded grimly. With all the octarine light in this magical place, the creatures had been gorging themselves, and then nature had taken its course. The picture box sidled away on its tripod. Rincewind aimed a kick at it and missed. He was beginning to dislike sapient pearwood.